an old friend and colleague of many years who was one of the stars of the New York edition of this threat briefing last week, Roger Robinson, to join us. Roger has served in government at very high levels. He was, among other things, the senior director for international economic affairs on the Reagan National Security Council. And in that capacity, he played an absolutely instrumental role in helping President Reagan translate the recommendations and strategic vision that he adopted in part from an earlier iteration of the Committee on the Present Danger in the mid-1970s, and then executed it as president with, again, particularly help from Roger and Judge William P. Clark, whom he served ably, the then National Security Advisor, in executing the takedown strategy that ultimately liberated hundreds of millions of people from the evil empire. This is an inspirational story that has informed what we're trying to do here in the Committee on the Present Danger China. And I'm delighted to have Roger here to talk a bit about the fact that we are financing the present danger from China. Roger Robinson, welcome.
Well, thank you, Frank. It's always a pleasure to be with so many familiar and friendly faces, all with a shared, very healthy skepticism of the environment we're facing and its perils. I'm here representing my think tank today, the Prague Security Studies Institute. I do have a risk management company that's in the business in part of being an impartial data provider, but one of the key benefits that we've derived from the corporate side of my world is that our Prague Security Studies Institute has been able to take advantage of the fact that we have a open source software tool called IntelTrack that tracks and visually maps every Chinese and Russian transaction worldwide on a daily basis, and that data going back 6 years. I don't know any other entity out there in the private sector that has that kind of granular data available, or this kind of ongoing effort of 5 analysts trying to sweep up, if you will, best we can, everything that the Chinese are up to out there. Not what they're saying, but rather what they're doing. And that includes on the money side of things, not just the trade and project side. Now, this ability to visually map what's up is very helpful. For example, we were the first firm to identify every Chinese company that is helping build and militarize the illegal islands in the South China Sea. And when you blow out a map, not just of those companies themselves, but of their entire network of subsidiaries, and you look at what we call that global footprint, it is most impressive and troubling. You have companies there that are, of course, working for the PLA, some of which have 15 offices in the United States. Others is listed on the New York Stock Exchange. In other words, there's been no penalty, no sanction for these state-owned enterprises to date. And that is something we should be asking ourselves about as to what's up there, because it is extraordinary that this is complete business as usual at a time where it's unmistakable that these are not benign commercial activities, but rather under the instruction and guidance of the PLA. Big surprise. And obviously, through the National Intelligence Law and Article 7, which you've heard about many times and so forth, every Chinese entity has to be responsive when called upon by the party for espionage or other strategic missions, if you will, of the party. And they all have Communist Party cells that have been reinserted into their management structures. So this is obviously quite a surprise to some who thought that the Chinese were going to be smart enough to, in a sense, try to divest away from the PLA and cleanse their companies so that they would be more acceptable business partners to the West. They did this for years, but President Xi, with more of a Mao complex, is seeking to, in effect, re-centralize control, which is helpful in some odd ways to the American security community because it basically helps the job get done that we would otherwise be piecing together on a painstaking basis. So when we look at the number of companies that are in our capital markets today that are Chinese, we find that some 600 and over 650 such enterprises are there. They're probably around 86 in the New York Stock Exchange, 62 in NASDAQ, and over 500 in the over-the-counter market, which is, as you know, the least regulated and the most popular for those seeking to skirt transparency and disclosure requirements. So here is a wide spectrum of companies. Many of them would be seen, politely put, as high-risk entities. Less politely put are outright bad actors. And I'm talking about national security abusers of all stripe, as well as human rights abusers. And we can talk about some hard examples of this, but we're not, unfortunately, talking about a few tens of millions of dollars. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars and moving rapidly toward $1 trillion. Now, that's a lot of financing that's being attracted from unwitting American investors. And I say unwitting because where do we find in the risk section of the portfolios, for example, for the equity investments, you expect to see in the prospectus a kind of risk section, as I say, where all of their potential material risk issues are enumerated. Well, good luck on that. They're simply not there. Whether we're talking about sanctions violators, proliferators of weapons of mass destruction, ballistic missiles, known cyber hackers, those companies that are building and militarizing the islands in the South China Sea, as I mentioned, those that are underwriting the North Korean threat, and too many others to name, not to mention, on the human rights side, those that are providing surveillance cameras and facial recognition technology and the like to help maintain the incarceration of some 1 million Uyghurs in Xinjiang in what are politely called detention camps. Many others are calling them concentration camps. And this is something that we average Americans are unwittingly financing in their retirement portfolios and other investment portfolios. For example, the California teachers' retirement system is quite heavily invested in Hikvision. Worse still are what we call the index funds, like the MSCI index, Emerging Market Index, and their World Index. Now, here you have a passive investment vehicle. You have people buying into a list of companies that MSCI puts together. There's $2 trillion of funds under management that track that index. There's about $14 trillion more that mimic it. So every time MSCI adds a mainland Chinese stock, what they call A shares, you have $16 trillion of funds under management either voluntarily or, in the case of those 2 trillion, compelled to buy that stock and hold it in portfolio. You know, with an index, you don't choose, well, I don't want that one, you know. It's a package deal, as you know. If you look at the Bloomberg Barclays aggregate bond fund, or a global aggregate index, I guess it's called, you have $54 trillion of funds under management that have announced that they're starting to buy companies to add to it from the Chinese mainland exchanges, the Shenzhen and the Shanghai exchanges. They're going to add 361 such companies in the next 20 months, and began doing so on April 1st. This is not something that is a prospective problem. This is happening as we're sitting here. So just imagine the windfall for China of PLA-affiliated companies, advanced weapons manufacturers, who are seeing their stock added to an index, and boom, not only do they have a windfall of money flowing into their coffers, but they have penetrated practically every healthy cell of the American body politic. How many people do we have in our country in the markets today? 180 million and 200 million Americans? I don't know the number, but you can appreciate that it's disturbingly high. And when you look at the pace at which the Chinese are coming into our markets for dollar financing, at which they're desperate for, you start to see a trend where trillions of dollars are going to flow into our markets over the next 2 to 3 years, to such an extent that it is conceivable that one morning the American people wake up and find, whether it's 12%, 15%, 17%, some high number of their investment portfolios or their retirement portfolios are Chinese securities. Well, guess what happens that day? The China lobby, as we know it today, appears to be a trivial asterisk next to what's coming, when, again, these folks realize that any American penalties or sanctions toward China, based on its malevolent behavior, could and probably would devalue or damage the value, another way to put it, of their retirement and pension systems. So we can't allow ourselves to be put into this situation, because they will tie up the Congress and the executive branch in knots the likes we've never seen. And it is in some ways checkmate. So we're in a race, ladies and gentlemen. This is not something that we can kind of get to in the next year or two. We have to be on this now. You know, we're all talking about U.S.-China trade, justifiably, to a fairly well. What about the capital markets? Our capital markets are practically the size of the rest of the world's combined. You know, the Japanese have such onerous disclosure requirements and so much bureaucracy to get into their markets that China has all of 4 companies in the Tokyo exchanges. Why not just circumvent Japan and head for that great free lunch program in the United States, where, again, you have over 650, but that number, as we can see from these index providers, is exploding. It'll be well over 1,000 soon, if not already. I mean, we just have to keep up with it. So what do we do in this circumstance? And I do want to leave some time for a question or two. And it's really about, at minimum, disclosure and transparency. It's not necessarily cutting them out of the markets or anything so draconian that you'd have all of Wall Street and trillions of dollars mobilizing their lobbyists to come down and make sure that Nothing happens to the, quote, competitiveness of our exchanges. Nothing happens to the free flow of global capital or contracting the investable universe of our fund managers. These are their lines. These are the fear-mongering that we can expect from Wall Street in that circumstance. But what happens if we're simply asking for the enforcement of market principles? What about if we're hanging our hat on disclosure? Let's have them disclose that they're a major island builder in the South China Sea, or that they have been sanctioned in the past for any number of reasons. You know, you're not finding that, again, in the risk sections today. You know, we had a case where CCCC, China Communications Construction Corporation, the largest player on the Silk Road, huge builder of the South China Sea because of their dredging operations, tried to go to the Hong Kong Stock Exchange for $1 billion IPO. We played a role in forcing the insistence that they disclose their South China Sea island building, and they refused to do so because it would mean admitting that it was controversial. It would mean that it was admitting that it was disputed at the very least, something that they absolutely ideologically found intolerable. And so it didn't happen. And so we came back and said, okay, fine, well, then get ready for the class action lawsuit because this is a material omission. This is a risk that investors need to know, and if they don't know, it can be legally actionable in a class actions context. And guess what? CCCC Dredging pulled the IPO rather than to face their masters in Beijing having to admit that they disclosed their South China Sea involvements as a risk. Now, this is an elegant solution for us. We're taking the Wall Street principles, the market principles, and we're going to use them to advance our national security interests. And who's going to be against disclosure? It'll be very interesting. You'll see that there are people, but it's pretty transparent as to what they're up to. So I'd like to just give you a sense in closing here that there are a number of companies in the MSCI index, including Hikvision on the concentration camp side of the Uyghurs, companies like China Unicom, AVIC, China Shipbuilding. These are heavy PLA contractors. Some, like AVIC, have faced sanctions galore in the past, and yet here they are in the most privileged of circumstances, and again, something that I'm sure they pinch themselves every morning because they can't believe their good fortune. We've never put up a security-minded screen over our cap markets in the history of this country. We have never delisted a Chinese company for national security reasons in the history of our country that I know of. Well, if we're not willing to even perform the diligence ourselves, you know, if the SEC is falling down on this because they don't accept that national security abuses and human rights abuses are a material risk to share value and corporate reputation, I can assure you they are wrong. Amen. Even from a straight investment point of view, even if you had no concern whatsoever about the security of our country, this is bad business.
Amen.
So I want to leave it there. Thank you.
Raj, you want to take one question? Sure. We've got a number of questions. We also have Congressman Perry in the room, and I know he can't stay long. So we'll take one from you, Faith, and one from you. One question.
Hi,
two
Faith
parts.
McDonald from the Institute on Religion and Democracy, and I learned everything I ever knew about capital market sanctions from Roger. I don't know if you remember when we were in 9/11 in the Rayburn building together.
I do.
So, well, no surprise, I'm still working on South Sudan and Sudan issues, and what you said applies so much on Africa. We talk in liberal terms, they talk about intersectionality in victimhood. Well, there's intersectionality in unwise actions that America's taking, and this is one of them. And I wondered if you could talk something about how not just capital market sanctions, but the investments that we're losing out on, our businesses are losing out on in Africa to China. And particularly, I know that they have made inroads in South Sudan because, to get back to intersectionality, we've taken a wrong perspective on the government of South Sudan, and we've isolated ourselves from all the potential that we have of investment in South Sudan.
Well, that gets to the broader issue of the predatory nature of Chinese enterprises as backed by China Development Bank, China Exim Bank, all of the state-controlled banking entities. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a rigged game. I mean, you're up against an untenable foe from a commercial perspective. Commercial terms and conditions, the profit motive, share value, all at the center of American and Western investment concerns, don't happen to be part of the equation here. They are going for a strategic play, and they are not in the habit of losing. So the point is, we are not remotely on an even playing field, and until we wake up and smell the coffee on that, I think that we're going to continue to lose our shirts. Now, the good news is that Belt and Road has been unearthed to be what many of us long suspected it was. Made in China 2025, same. So we are making progress, but now comes the time for pushback. And that's the way I would answer that.